Picture this: someone at work is talking to you. You're looking at them, you're nodding. But inside your head, you're already writing your reply. If they make a point you disagree with, you want to explain why. If they've misunderstood something, you want to correct them. You're not really listening anymore. You're waiting for your turn. I think most of us have been in that moment. And what's interesting is, you usually don't realize it's happening. You think we're having a conversation, but actually, we've quietly turned it into a competition. In today's episode, I want to explore one idea that has genuinely changed how I think about difficult conversations at work. And it's simply this: it's not you versus them. It's both of you versus the problem. By the end, I want you to understand why conversations drift into competitions without anyone deciding they should. And 3 simple questions you want to ask yourself before a difficult conversation that can make a real difference. I should say up front, I'm not sharing this as someone who has mastered it. The more I look at those situations, the more I notice the same pattern underneath. The conversation has quietly become a competition, and nobody decided to make it one. Now, let's get into why this actually happens. What's interesting is that I've started to think this is where many difficult conversations begin. Not when somebody raises their voice, not when somebody gets defensive. Much earlier than that. They begin when both people quietly decide they're there to win. Now, when I say win, I don't mean beating the other person. Most of us don't walk into work thinking, today I'm going to defeat my colleague. It's much more subtle than that. We want to be understood. We want our ideas to be taken seriously. We want people to see the situation the way we see it. There's nothing wrong with wanting those things. They're completely normal. The problem starts when getting our own outcome becomes more important than understanding what's going on for the other person. Without realizing it, the conversation changes. Instead of feeling like 2 people trying to solve a problem together, it starts to feel like a tug of war. There's one idea I keep coming back to. It's almost too simple. It's not you versus them. It's both of you versus the problem. The first time I heard something like that, I thought, well, obviously, of course, that's how conversations should work. But understanding an idea is one thing, remembering it when you're under pressure is something else entirely. It's much harder to think like that when someone has criticized your work, or challenged your judgment, or misunderstood what you meant. That's usually the moment when the other person starts to feel like the problem. And that's the moment I try to notice more quickly. Because once I start seeing the person as the problem, everything they say sounds different. A question feels like a criticism. A disagreement feels like rejection. A different opinion feels like they're against me. Before long, I'm no longer trying to solve the issue. I'm trying to overcome the person. I've also been wondering whether many workplace conversations become difficult because both people are trying to solve different problems. Think about a conversation between a manager and an employee. The manager might be thinking, we need to improve performance. The employee might be thinking, I need to explain why this has happened. Neither person is trying to create conflict. Neither person has bad intentions. But they're walking into the conversation with different goals. It's a bit like 2 people opening the same map. But one thinks they're traveling to London, while the other thinks they're traveling to Manchester. Neither person is refusing to cooperate. They're simply trying to get somewhere different. The more each person explains their route, the more confused the other becomes. Sometimes I wonder if difficult conversations work in the same way. We're not always arguing because one person is unreasonable. Sometimes we're arguing because we haven't agreed on what the problem we're trying to solve. So now, before an important conversation, I'm trying to ask myself a different question. Not how do I explain this better, but what problem do they think we're here to solve? I find that the question changes my mindset before the conversation has even started. I should add something important here. This way of thinking isn't meant for every situation. If someone is bullying you, harassing you, or behaving abusively, that situation is very different. Those situations need clear boundaries, accountability, and where appropriate, proper external support. I'm talking about the everyday conversations that are difficult that most of us have at work. The conversations where 2 people are trying to do their jobs but somehow end up pulling in different directions. For those conversations, I'm starting to believe this mindset can make a real difference. Because the moment I stop asking, how do I win? And start asking, how do we solve this together? I've already changed the conversation before either of us have had said very much. But that still leaves a question I've been thinking about. Why do conversations become competition so easily in the first place? Because most people don't enjoy conflict. Most people would actually prefer to avoid it. So why does it happen so often? That's what I want to explore next. I don't think people turn conversations into competitions because they're naturally difficult. And I don't think it's usually because someone woke up in the morning wanted to make life harder for everybody else. I think something else is going on. I think most people are trying to protect something that's important to them. Let me give an example. Imagine a manager leading a big project. The deadline is getting closer, there's pressure from every direction, and now a milestone suddenly has been missed. When the manager starts that conversation, what are they worried about? Maybe the project slipping further, maybe how this reflects them on them as a leader. Now look at the employee. They've been working really hard, juggling several priorities, perhaps struggling but not feeling comfortable saying so. When the manager raises the issue, what might they be worried about? Do they think I'm not good enough? Am I going to lose their trust? Do you see what's happened? They're talking about the same deadline, but they're protecting different things. The manager is thinking about the success of the project. The employee may be thinking about their reputation. But if neither person understands what matters to the other, the conversation quickly becomes defensive. Before, I used to assume conflict meant someone wasn't listening. Now I'm starting to think that sometimes both people are listening, they're just listening through different concerns, and those concerns affect what they hear. It explains why two people can leave the same meeting with completely different experiences. One person thinks, that was a good conversation. The other thinks, they didn't listen to a word I said. The meeting was the same, the words were the same, but the experience wasn't. I've also started noticing something about myself. When I'm too focused on getting my point across, I stop being curious. Not on purpose, it just happens. The more I think about what I want to say, the less interested I become in what the other person's actually trying to tell me. And I've noticed that curiosity and defensiveness don't work very well together. When I'm defending myself, I'm usually asking fewer questions. When I'm genuinely curious, I don't feel as defensive. Those two mindsets pull in opposite directions. That has changed the way I think about listening. For a long time, I thought listening was mainly about being polite, not interrupting, making eye contact where appropriate, letting the other person finish. Those things matter, but I think good listening starts much earlier. It starts with deciding why I'm actually in the conversation. If I'm there to prove I'm right, I'll probably hear everything through that filter. If I'm there to understand what's really going on, I'll ask different questions. I'll probably hear things I would have missed before. One more thing on this. Understanding someone isn't the same as agreeing with them. I think that's an important difference here. Sometimes we worry that if we really listen to someone, we're somehow accepting their point of view. I don't think that's true. You can understand exactly why someone thinks the way they do and still believe they're mistaken. Listening doesn't mean giving up on your own view. It simply means you're trying to understand theirs before asking them to understand yours. And that feels like a much stronger place to begin. Which brings me to an idea I keep coming back to. And if I'm honest, it's one that people may find harder to put into practice than it sounds. The problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. The first time I heard that, I thought it sounded obvious. A person can stop talking about the problem and start talking about the person. Instead of thinking this report was submitted late, a person may start to think he's unreliable, or instead of we keep misunderstanding each other, it becomes he's impossible to work with. In the first example, I'm talking about something that has happened. In the second, I'm making a judgment about who the person is. And that changes the conversation completely. Imagine someone says to you, you're lazy. How would you respond? Most of us would probably become defensive. We'd start thinking about all the times we've worked late, everything we've achieved. The conversation quickly becomes about defending ourselves. Now imagine someone says, The last 3 reports came in after the deadline, and that's made things harder for the rest of the team. That's still uncomfortable to hear, but it's different. Now we're talking about something specific, something we can discuss, something we can improve. It's much more helpful to separate behavior from identity, not because labels are always wrong, but because they rarely move the conversation forward. When we label people, conversation usually gets harder. When we talk about behavior, there's still room to solve the problem. I've realized how easy it is to do this to yourself. After a conversation doesn't go well, it's easy to think, I'm terrible at difficult conversations, I'm just not confident, I'm not good with people. These thoughts feel true in the moment, but are they? Or are they just labels we've given ourselves? A better question might be, what did I do in that conversation that I'd like to do differently next time? That feels much more useful, because now I'm talking about something I can improve, not something that's fixed. The image that can help with this is, I imagine the problem sitting on the table between us. We're both looking at it, we're both trying to understand it. We're not staring at each other across the table. We're standing on the same side trying to work on what's going on. It's difficult to practice this. Sometimes you can get frustrated. Sometimes you may still take things personally. Sometimes you may leave a meeting and realize you spent most of it trying to prove your point. Something else has also become clear to me. For a long time, I thought difficult conversations was mainly about finding the right words. If I could just say it perfectly, everything would work out. Now I'm not so sure. Words matter, tone matters, but mindset matters even more. Because if I walk into a conversation genuinely wanting to understand the other person, I'll probably able to ask better questions. I'll probably interrupt less, listen more carefully. I won't have to force those behaviors. They'll happen naturally because my goal has changed. That's why I think the biggest shift isn't learning clever communication techniques. It's changing the way we think before the conversation even begins. Because the conversation happening in our own mind usually becomes a conversation we have with the other person. Now let me share 3 questions that may help you in these difficult conversations. One thing understanding the idea, but it's another thing to remember when you're in a meeting and emotions are starting to rise. I realized the best time to prepare for a difficult conversation isn't during the conversation. It's not by rehearsing the perfect words, but by asking myself a few simple questions. Question 1, what problem are we trying to solve here? It sounds obvious, but I don't think it always is. Imagine you're meeting a colleague because a project has fallen behind. You might think the problem is missed deadlines. They might think the problem is unclear priorities. Someone else might be thinking the problem is lack of resources. You're all talking about the same project, but you're not talking about the same problem. If we don't realize that, you can spend half an hour trying to solve completely different things. That's why I find it helpful to stop and ask, what problem are we actually trying to solve together? Sometimes that question changes the whole conversation. Question 2, what might matter most to the other person? When I'm under pressure, my attention naturally turns to myself, my deadlines, my workload, my concerns. I want to say, but the other person has their own pressures too. Maybe they're worried about something I haven't thought about. Maybe they're under pressure from the manager. Maybe they're trying to protect their team's reputation, and maybe they carry responsibilities I know nothing about. I don't need to agree with them, but I think it's worth trying to understand what matters to them, because once I understand that, their behavior often makes a little more sense. And when people's behavior makes more sense, it's usually easier to have a good conversation with them. And the final question, what would a good outcome look like for both of us? Sometimes 2 people still disagree at the end of a conversation, but they understand each other much better. They know what's expected, they've cleared up misunderstandings, they've agreed on the next step. That's still progress. Sometimes the goal isn't complete agreement. Sometimes it's simply leaving the conversation with more understanding than you've had when you walked in. Those 3 questions can serve as a useful reminder. What problem are we solving? What matters to the other person? What would success look like for both of us? They help you walk into a conversation with a very different mindset. I often think we judge difficult conversations by the outcome. Did they apologize? Did they change? Did they agree with me? Those things matter sometimes, but they're not completely within our control. What is in our control is how we show up. Did we listen? Did we stay respectful? Did we ask good questions? Did we try to understand before trying to persuade? Those are questions we can actually answer, and perhaps they're better measuring whether we've handled the conversation well. And remember, there's a difference between challenging someone's behavior and trying to defeat them. That's an important difference. It reminds us that the person sitting across from us is another human being, someone with their own pressures, their own worries, and their own struggles, just like us. That doesn't mean they're always right, and it doesn't mean that we have to agree with them, but it does remind us to approach the conversation with a little more humility, because I don't know everything they're carrying, just as they don't know everything I'm carrying. And I think that mindset creates more room for patience, more room for understanding, and often better conversations. The moment we stop seeing each other as the problem, we're much more likely to start solving the real problem. So before your next difficult conversation, perhaps try this small experiment. Instead of asking yourself, how do I get to see them? Instead of asking yourself, how do I get them to see my point? Ask, how can I solve this problem together? Or ask, how can we solve this problem together? It might not change the other person, but I think it will change how you show up. And sometimes that's enough to change the direction of the conversation. If these reflections have been useful, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you for spending the time on the podcast. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.